How did people manage to survive in the steppe at temperatures of minus 40 degrees, with only the skins of dead animals and wooden poles at their disposal? We are accustomed to considering modern materials to be the pinnacle of comfort, but many centuries ago, the indigenous peoples of America created structures that surpassed many modern tents in terms of efficiency. Winter storms on the Great Plains could bury an entire caravan under snow in a single night, and the only protection from freezing to death was shelter. This was not magic or primitive survival, but precise engineering based on the laws of physics, which these people understood on an intuitive level. Their homes could withstand winds capable of knocking down modern buildings and retain heat when rivers froze outside. In this endless battle with nature, the stakes were high because the slightest mistake in the construction of the roof could cost the entire family their lives. Watch the video to the end to find out how a simple strip of leather stretched inside the dwelling saved people from certain death in smoke and cold. What if I told you that the ideal shape for wind protection was invented long before the advent of wind tunnels? The tipi, the dwelling of the nomadic peoples of the plains, at first glance appears to be a simple cone, but its geometry conceals the most complex engineering solutions. This cone was never symmetrical, as the back wall was always made steeper and the front wall more gradual. This feature allowed the structure to withstand the pressure of the prevailing westerly winds, which literally flowed around the dwelling without encountering any significant resistance. The angle of the poles was calculated with mathematical precision so that the center of gravity shifted in the right direction, ensuring incredible stability for the entire structure. The base of this pyramid was not a random arrangement of poles, but a strict system of 3 or 4 support poles. These main poles were tied together at the top with a special knot, which tightened the more the load on the structure increased. The remaining poles were laid in a specific sequence, creating a rigid frame resembling an interwoven basket. This structure distributed the wind pressure evenly across the entire surface, preventing any single point from becoming critically weak. Even hurricane-force winds hitting such a structure only pressed it more firmly to the ground instead of knocking it over. There was not a single superfluous element inside this frame, and each detail performed its function in maintaining the shape. The oval base of the tipi, unlike a perfect circle, also worked on aerodynamics, allowing the dwelling to be oriented in the most advantageous way to the wind. The entrance was always located on the east side, where the winds blew extremely rarely, which prevented the room from cooling down when entering and exiting. The poles themselves were made of pine, which was flexible and durable, allowing the frame to breathe slightly under the gusts of the storm. The top of the cone was left open not only to allow smoke to escape, but also to reduce the windage of the highest point. If the teepee had been completely closed at the top, a strong gust of wind could have created a low-pressure area and torn off the cover. The open valve equalized the pressure inside and outside, making the structure inert to atmospheric front changes. This was the same principle used today in the construction of skyscrapers in earthquake-prone areas. Wooden pegs played a special role, securing the edge of the tire to the ground around the entire perimeter. In winter, these pegs were driven into the frozen ground with special effort or replaced with heavy stones, creating a reliable foundation. The tension of the tire was so strong that it sounded like a drum under the blows of the wind, but it did not sag or flap. Any sagging could lead to the accumulation of snow or water, which threatened to tear the material. In the event of an extreme storm, a special anchor rope was stretched inside the dwelling, running from the top of the cone to the center of the floor. This rope was tied to a stake driven into the ground or to a heavy load that could not be moved. This vertical tension turned a light tent into a monolith capable of withstanding pressure of several hundred kilograms. This solution made it possible to survive the most terrible nights when the wind uprooted trees. The entire structure was designed for quick assembly and disassembly, but when assembled, it was a fortress. The women of the tribe, who traditionally set up the dwellings, could erect one in less than an hour. They knew the nature of each pole and each fold of the skin, fitting them together with jeweler's precision. It was an art passed down from generation to generation, where experience replaced drawings and instructions. Interestingly, the height of the tepee varied depending on the season and purpose, but the proportions always remained the same. Winter dwellings were often made slightly lower and wider to reduce wind resistance and retain heat more easily. Every centimeter of slope was the result of centuries of observation of wind behavior in the open steppe. An error in the angle of inclination of just a few degrees could cause the dwelling to collapse in the first storm. Thus, this simple cone was actually a complex aerodynamic machine, perfectly adapted to its environment. Indigenous peoples did not fight the wind by trying to build a wall, but used its power by making it flow around their dwellings. This understanding of nature allowed them to live where others could not survive for even a day. We would love to hear your opinion. Do you think modern tourist tents can withstand the same stresses as these ancient structures? Write about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories about the technologies of the past. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the walls separating people from the deadly cold were really made of? We are used to seeing bleached and clean skins in museums, but the real covering of a winter dwelling was completely different. It was a heavy membrane, saturated with smoke and fat, made from bison hides sewn together into a single sheet. The process of creating such armor took weeks of hard work and required a deep knowledge of the chemistry of natural materials. The hides were not simply dried, but underwent complex processing to prevent them from cracking in the cold and rotting from moisture. To create one large cover, 12 to 20 hides of adult animals, carefully selected for thickness, were required. They were sewn together with sinews, which swelled when wet and tightly sealed the needle holes, making the seams completely waterproof. But the main secret was the smoking process, which turned ordinary rawhide into water-repellent material. The skins were held over a smoldering fire of rotten wood for hours until the smoke penetrated the very structure of the fibers. Such smoked leather acquired the property of remaining soft even after becoming completely wet and then drying out. Ordinary leather in such conditions would turn into stiff cardboard that breaks when bent. In winter conditions, when snow melted on the warm surface of the dwelling and then froze again, the elasticity of the material was a matter of life and death. The covering had to withstand the weight of the snowcap and hailstorms without losing its integrity. The thickness of the bison hide provided excellent wind protection, acting as a dense barrier to icy air currents. Unlike fabric, leather has a complex fibrous structure that perfectly retains heat inside the room. Light passing through such translucent skin was tinged with warm golden tones, creating a cozy atmosphere inside even on a cloudy day. At night, when the fire was burning inside, the tepee glowed from within, resembling a huge lantern in the middle of a dark plain. The weight of such a cover was enormous, sometimes reaching hundreds of kilograms, which in itself served as an additional factor of stability. The heavy leather pressed down on the frame, holding it to the ground and preventing the poles from shifting in the wind. Lifting and stretching such a huge structure onto the poles required the coordinated work of several people and the use of a special lifting pole. This was the culmination of the construction process, when the separate parts were transformed into a single whole. In places of greatest tension and friction against the poles, the leather was reinforced with additional patches. The entrance was closed with a separate flap made of skin, which was often weighted down with wooden slats or fur. This created a tight seal that could be easily opened but closed under its own weight. There were no zippers or buttons. Only gravity and friction ensured the entrance was airtight. Over time, the tire became so saturated with soot from the hearth that it turned almost black at the top. This layer of soot and grease served as additional insulation and protection from moisture running down the poles during rain. Old tires that had become too stiff or full of holes were not thrown away, but used to make moccasins or repair other items. The cycle of material use was closed and waste-free, which was the norm for life in the wild. Interestingly, skins with thick winter fur were often used for winter dwellings, leaving it on the inside or outside depending on the tribe. This created an additional air layer that worked like modern insulation in the walls of houses. The fur trapped snow, which is a good insulator in itself, creating a natural fur coat for the dwelling. Caring for such a covering required constant attention. It had to be regularly tightened or loosened depending on the humidity. Leather is a hygroscopic material, It breathes, reacting to changes in the weather by expanding or contracting. People lived inside a living organism that changed along with the environment. Without this protective layer, survival in the open winds of the plains would have been absolutely impossible. It was bison leather, processed by the hands of craftsmen, that made it possible to create a microclimate suitable for life. But even the thickest walls are useless if you are suffocating from the smoke of your own hearth. In the next chapter, you will learn how ancient engineers solved the ventilation problem that stumps even modern builders. Want to know the secret that changes everything about comfort in the wild? The main problem with any heated tent is not the cold, but smoke and condensation, which can kill faster than frost. The solution was an ingenious innovation that researchers called dew cloth, or inner lining. It was a layer of leather or fabric that was stretched inside the tipi along poles, starting from the ground and reaching human height. This seemingly simple curtain completely changed the physics of air movement inside the living space. Cold air entering under the edges of the outer cover did not immediately enter the living area, cooling the sleeping people. Instead, it entered the corridor between the outer wall and the inner lining, where it began its upward journey. This flow created a powerful draft, acting like a pump, drawing smoke from the fire up to the upper opening. Thanks to this chimney effect, the fire in the center of the dwelling burned evenly and brightly without filling the room with acrid smoke. The smoke rose vertically, caught by the upward airflow, and escaped into the sky through the smoke vents. Without this inner wall, any gust of wind would blow the smoke back into people's faces, making life inside unbearable. In addition to ventilation, the interior lining created an insulating air layer that worked like a thermos. Air is one of the best heat insulators, and this buffer between the icy outer wall and the living space retained heat. The temperature difference was enormous. A blizzard could rage outside while inside people sat in light clothing. This curtain also protected against condensation, which inevitably formed on the cold outer shell. Water droplets ran down the inside of the outer wall and drained into the ground without dripping on the inhabitants' heads or wetting their beds. The interior remained dry, which was critical for preventing disease and retaining heat. The lower edge of the inner lining was tightly tucked under the floor covering, completely blocking drafts at floor level. This created an airtight bowl of warm air in which it was possible to sleep directly on the ground. Even babies could crawl around on the floor without fear of catching a cold from the icy breath of the earth. This inner wall was often decorated with drawings depicting the exploits of warriors or family history. This transformed a utilitarian element of the structure into an art gallery and a chronicle of the tribe. Sitting by the fire, people saw not the framework of their dwelling, but vivid images of their culture, illuminated by the soft light of the fire. The height of the cladding was usually about 1.5 to 2 meters, which corresponded to the human living area. Above this line, the air was cooler and smokier, but no one stayed there permanently. The entire living space was reliably protected by this screen, separating comfort from harsh reality. Installing this lining was an essential part of preparing for winter, although it could be removed in summer for better ventilation. It was the presence of this element that distinguished a full-fledged house from a temporary shelter for hunters. It was not just an improvement, but a fundamental part of the life support system. The engineering behind this simple piece of leather is striking in its efficiency and elegance. Without complex fans and pipes, a perfect climate control system was created. Don't forget to like if you are also impressed by how simple solutions can be so effective. Are you ready for the shocking truth that not all Native Americans lived in portable tents? On the banks of the Missouri River, tribes such as the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Pawnee built monumental earthen houses that resembled bunkers. These structures were designed to survive the harshest winters, using earth as the main building material. The huge dome, covered with a thick layer of turf, became a natural extension of the landscape, blending in with the hills. The foundation of such a house was a strong frame made of trunks from centuries-old trees, which were floated down the river or brought from far away. 4 central pillars supported the enormous weight of the roof, which consisted of logs, willow rods, dry grass, and earth. The walls were 1/2 meter thick or more, creating the effect of a basement, where the temperature always remained stable. In summer, such a house was cool, and in winter, the earthen walls slowly released the heat accumulated during the summer. The entrance to the earthen house was a long covered tunnel that served as a heat barrier. This corridor, often hung with heavy bison hides, blocked out the cold air and wind, preventing them from entering the main room. Firewood or equipment was often stored inside this tunnel, creating an additional buffer between the street and the dwelling. One had to crouch down to enter, which also had a defensive purpose in case of enemy attack. The floor in such a dwelling was often sunk half a meter or a meter into the ground, which further enhanced the thermal insulation. The ground at this depth does not freeze even in the most severe frosts, providing natural heating from below. The walls of the pit were reinforced with wood or wattle to prevent the soil from crumbling into the living space. In the center of the huge round hall, which could reach 15 meters in diameter, there was a hearth. Smoke escaped through an opening in the center of the dome, which also served as the only window for sunlight. Around the hearth, several families shared this huge space divided by wicker screens or curtains. The earthen roof was so sturdy that it was safe to walk on, and people often used it as an observation deck. Children played on the roofs, and elders sat there on sunny days, watching the life of the village. In winter, the snow that accumulated on the dome became an extra layer of insulation rather than a problem. However, this design had its drawbacks. During the rainy season, the roof could leak if it was not properly maintained. Therefore, the turf was regularly renewed, and cracks were filled with clay to maintain the integrity of the shell. Inside such a house, there was a smell of earth, smoke, and dry grass. The smell of reliability and permanence. These houses were designed to last for decades, being passed down from generation to generation. Unlike the light teepees, the earthen house was a symbol of a settled life and attachment to a particular place. Inside such mounds, people survived the frost that killed all living things on the surface. Earth houses also served as a refuge for the tribe's best horses on the coldest nights. The animals were brought inside, and their warmth helped to heat the huge room. It was a cramped neighborhood, but it guaranteed the survival of both the people and their main wealth: horses. Building such a house was a grand project that required the efforts of the entire community. These were real underground palaces, hidden from the eyes of the uninitiated under the modest appearance of earthen mounds. How comfortable do you think it would be for a modern person to spend the winter in such an earthen house without electricity or running water? In the next chapter, you will learn about a completely different approach to construction used by forest dwellers. The peoples who inhabited the forested regions of the Northeast chose a completely different survival strategy. The Iroquois built their famous longhouses, which resembled huge hangars covered with elm bark. These structures could reach a length of 100 meters, accommodating an entire clan of dozens of families under one roof. Unlike nomads, they relied on the massiveness of the structure and the collective warmth of many people. The frame of a longhouse was made of flexible young trees that were stuck into the ground and tied together at the top to form an arch. This arch shape was ideal for snow runoff and wind resistance, as it had no flat surfaces that a hurricane could press against. The walls and roof were covered with large sheets of bark, which were removed from trees at a certain time of year. The bark was laid like tiles, overlapping, and held in place by an outer frame of poles to prevent it from being blown away by the wind. There were no nails. Everything was held together by bast ropes and the elasticity of the wood itself. Willow bark is a material that is surprisingly resistant to rot and moisture and can last for decades. Inside the longhouse was a central corridor, along which were located hearths, one for every two families living opposite each other. This row of fires created a common thermal contour that heated the entire volume of the building. The smoke escaped through openings in the roof, which could be closed with sheets of bark during heavy rain or snowfall. Along the walls, two-tiered bunks were built, which served as both sleeping places and storage space for supplies. The lower tier, raised above the ground, was used for sleeping to avoid contact with the cold soil. The upper tier, located in a warmer area under the roof, was intended for drying grain and storing things. The insulation of the walls was reinforced with reed mats and skins, which were hung inside for additional warmth. In winter, the gaps between the bark sheets were carefully caulked with moss and clay, turning the light structure into an airtight cocoon. The entrances at the ends of the house were protected by double doors or vestibules made of skins. The floor in a longhouse was often lined with spruce branches and mats, creating a dry and warm layer. People slept huddled together and covered with shared fur blankets, using body heat as additional heating. There was no personal space in such a dormitory, but it was precisely this crowding that ensured survival. Supplies of firewood and food were stored directly inside or in outbuildings to minimize the need to go outside. Life in winter was concentrated inside this wooden tunnel, where semi-darkness and the constant smell of smoke reigned. The social structure of the clan was strengthened during these long winter months. Repairing such a house was a constant process. Replacing a rotten sheet of bark or strengthening the frame required a collective effort. The longhouse was a living organism that grew with the clan. It could be extended simply by adding new sections to the frame. This architecture was perfectly adapted to life in dense forests, where there was no shortage of building materials. The longhouse is a triumph of collectivism over harsh nature, where survival as an individual was impossible. What if I told you that the best material for combating the cold was the cold itself? The peoples of the subarctic and northern plains were well aware of the paradoxical property of snow. It consists of 90% air and is an excellent heat insulator. When severe frost set in, residents often surrounded the bases of their dwellings with high snowdrifts. This snow barrier closed the gaps at ground level and prevented drafts from entering the lower part of the dwelling where people slept. The temperature inside the snow cover can be significantly higher than on the surface, and this property was used to create temporary shelters. Hunters caught in a storm far from camp built quinzé, shelters made of large piles of snow. The snow was raked into a mound, allowed to settle and harden, bake, and then an inner cavity was dug out. In such a snow house, the temperature could remain around 0 degrees, even if it was 40 degrees below zero outside. The walls, 30 to 40 centimeters thick, reliably retained the heat from a small oil lamp, or even the warmth of the human body. The entrance was made below floor level so that cold air would accumulate in the cold pit at the entrance, while warm air would rise to the sleeping area. An important point was the creation of a ventilation hole in the ceiling to avoid suffocation from carbon dioxide. If a fire was lit inside, the walls began to thaw slightly, forming an icy crust that reflected heat even better and strengthened the structure. However, it was necessary to ensure that the snow did not melt too intensely and wet the clothes. Snow was also used to insulate summer dwellings by simply piling it onto walls made of branches or bark. It was free and endless construction foam available to everyone. The main thing was to be able to distinguish between the right kind of dense snow and loose snow, which does not hold its shape and does not provide warmth. Sometimes, to wait out a storm, people would bury themselves in the snow, using their own sleds or skins as a roof. Dogs in a team instinctively did the same, allowing the snow to completely cover them. There was no wind under the snow, and wind was the main killer in the open tundra or steppe. Knowledge of the properties of snow allowed people to travel vast distances in winter without having to carry heavy tents. A light snow knife or shovel became a tool for building a house anywhere. This turned a hostile desert into a place full of building materials. Snow blocks were also used as windbreaks around a campfire or the entrance to a tepee. A simple wall of snow bricks could create a sheltered area where a fire could be safely lit. It was temporary architecture, disappearing without a trace when spring arrived. Mastering the art of working with snow required an understanding of its structure, how it changes with wind, temperature, and time. An experienced survivalist could determine the suitability of snow for construction with a single touch of a mitten. Thus, the coldest substance of winter became man's greatest ally. In the next chapter, you will learn how they solved the problem of sleeping on frozen ground. Would you risk spending the night in a snow cave? Man's most insidious and merciless enemy in winter is not the icy air around him, but the frozen ground beneath his feet. It acts like a giant heat pump, drawing precious heat from the human body at an incredible rate through direct contact. Indigenous peoples knew from bitter experience that sleeping on the bare ground, even inside a well-heated warm dwelling, was a sure way to severe pneumonia and rapid death. No fire could compensate for the loss of heat escaping into the permafrost beneath their backs. Therefore, when setting up camp, great attention was paid to creating a reliable multi-layered cushion between the sleeping person and the ground. It was an entire engineering system, where each layer performed its specific insulation function. The first and coarsest layer was often fresh willow branches or thick spruce branches. They were laid out in a thick, springy mattress, sparing no material to create a reliable foundation. This lower layer of vegetation created the necessary air gap and physically raised the sleeping area above the level of the frozen ground. The air trapped between the branches acted as an excellent heat insulator, preventing the cold from the ground from reaching the person. Willow was the preferred material in open plains, as it grew in abundance in river valleys, where winter camps were usually set up. In addition, willow rods had good natural elasticity, replacing the springs of a modern bed. The complex weaving of the stems created an additional structure with thousands of tiny air pockets inside. Each of these cells acted as a barrier against the cold, significantly enhancing the overall insulation of the bed. The mats also protected the skins from direct contact with the branches, preventing damage and contamination. This was an important intermediate layer, separating the rough base from the soft bed. The final and most valuable layer was tanned bison hides with thick winter fur on which people slept directly. It is the winter fur of the bison that has unique natural properties that are not found in other materials. It is very thick, dense, and has a twisted pile structure, which allows it to retain a huge volume of warm air inside. Such a skin works like a thermos, keeping the human body temperature constant. For maximum effect, several layers of skins were often used, laid out in a sandwich pattern. Some skins were placed first side down, on top of mats, to create an insulating layer. Others were placed first side up to sleep on a soft surface, and the third layer was used as a cover. This multi-layered system ensured that the cold could not penetrate the body from any side. During the day, the beds were usually rolled up and used as comfortable seats and sofas for relaxation. This freed up space in the dwelling for daytime activities and kept the bedding dry and clean. Moisture was the main and most dangerous enemy of any insulation because wet fur stops providing warmth. Even the breath of sleeping people moistened the fur during the night, so it had to be dried. Whenever possible, the skins were regularly taken out into the frost and hung on poles to air out. The frosty air not only dried out the moisture, but also disinfected the bedding, killing insects and parasites. Freezing was the only available method of dry cleaning in the field. Completely dry bedding was the main guarantee of a warm and peaceful night. In some cultures, especially in the north, stationary wooden platforms were used for sleeping. They were raised a few centimeters or even higher above the ground, creating a reliable separation from the cold surface. This was more common among sedentary tribes living in permanent dugouts or wooden houses. Nomads rarely carried bulky boards for platforms with them. Moss absorbed moisture well, remained dry to the touch, and reliably retained the warmth of a child's body. Contaminated filler could be easily discarded and replaced with a fresh supply, which was stored in bags. It was an early and very effective version of modern high-tech insulation and hygiene products. Such care allowed children to survive even in the harshest frosts. Sometimes, to increase the comfort temperature, the ground around the hearth was specially prepared before bedtime. It was carefully tamped down to remove looseness or even specially calcined with a large fire before laying the flooring. Hot coals were raked aside and branches and skins were laid on the warmed area. The ground heated in this way could act as a massive heat accumulator for a long time. It gave off the accumulated energy to the bed from below, even after the main fire had burned out and gone out. It was the equivalent of modern underfloor heating, created with primitive means. The Indians used every opportunity to store heat for future use. This whole complex layered system was aimed at achieving one main goal. It was necessary to preserve one's own body heat at all costs, not letting it escape into the endless cold of the planet. People understood that they themselves were the only generators of heat under the blanket, and that this heat had to be preserved. The slightest gap in the insulation could lead to fatal consequences. Without this reliable foundation beneath them, no thick walls or hot fires could save them from hypothermia in their sleep. The earth in winter is a bottomless pit of energy that cannot be heated. The only way to survive is to separate yourself from it by creating your own isolated world. This is the art that children were taught from an early age. Construction techniques were important, but even more important was the ability to choose the right place for a camp. Winter camps were radically different from summer camps. While in summer they sought coolness and breeze, In winter, they sought shelter. The ideal location was deep river valleys covered with forests, especially cotton trees, poplars, and willows. The high banks of the rivers and the trees created a natural windbreak, reducing the wind speed in the camp several times over. The difference in wind strength between the open plateau and the lowlands could be enormous, which directly affected the comfort temperature. In addition, the trees provided fuel, which was consumed in huge quantities in winter. The camp was always oriented so that the entrances to the dwellings faced east towards the rising sun. The morning sun was the first source of heat after a long, cold night, and its rays had to penetrate inside. In addition, the prevailing westerly winds hit the rear, most fortified part of the teepee. People avoided low-lying areas where the coldest air could accumulate, frost pockets, choosing terraces slightly above river level but below the edge of the cliff. This required excellent knowledge of the terrain and hydrology to avoid flooding during sudden thaws. The availability of water was critical, but rivers froze in winter, so camps were set up where clean ice or snow could be easily obtained. Snow was cleaner than river water, but required fuel for heating, so the balance between the availability of firewood and water was key. The location of the tepees in the camp circle was also not random. In some cases, they were placed closer together to create a common barrier against wind and snowdrifts. Mutual assistance was easier when neighbors were within arm's reach. Winter camps were often permanent for several months, unlike mobile summer camps. This allowed for a more thorough setup, building paddocks for horses, clearing trails, and creating supplies. The migration to wintering grounds began long before the first snowfalls. Elders and scouts closely watched for signs, predicting the severity of the coming winter. A mistake in the forecast or a delay could result in the tribe finding itself in the open steppe during the first blizzard. Wintering grounds were often used year after year and were considered the property of certain clans. Knowing where to find a quiet harbor and dry firewood in the most severe frost was strategic information. Thus, geography became part of architecture. The landscape was used as an outer wall of the house, protecting small human dwellings from the fury of the elements. Fire was the true heart of a winter dwelling, but managing it properly in a confined space required real skill. On treeless plains where trees were rare, the main fuel was not the firewood we are familiar with. The Indians used sun-dried bison dung, which they called chips. These dense patties were prepared in huge quantities in advance, so that there would be no shortage of fuel in winter. This specific fuel had unique properties that made it indispensable in the steppe conditions. It burned very slowly and evenly, producing hot and stable coals that were ideal for long-term heating of dwellings and cooking. At the same time, such a fire produced virtually no smoke and emitted far fewer dangerous sparks than ordinary wood. This made it possible to maintain a comfortable temperature inside the teepee without the risk of suffocation. These stones played a vital role in the winter home heating system. Heated by the flames, they accumulated a huge amount of thermal energy. When the fire died down at night, these hot stones continued to radiate gentle heat for a long time, working like modern heating batteries. This allowed a comfortable temperature to be maintained in the dwelling, even during the hours when no one was watching the fire. During the most severe frosts, when a regular fire was not enough, ingenious reflectors were used. These were special screens made of flat stones or wet logs, which were placed directly behind the fire. The structure was positioned so as to reflect the heat wave from the fire in the desired direction. Raw wood was used deliberately so that the screen itself would not catch fire from the dangerous proximity of the flames. These screens effectively reflected the heat back into the depths of the dwelling, towards the sleeping quarters of the inhabitants. This technique significantly increased the efficiency of a small fire without the need to burn more scarce fuel. It allowed infrared radiation to be directed exactly where it was most needed for sleeping people. The Indians intuitively understood the laws of physics and used them for their own comfort. To carry fire during their travels, they used special devices made from hollow bison horns. They placed smoldering coals sprinkled with tinder inside, or used tightly twisted bundles of slowly smoldering bark. These portable fire keepers allowed them to quickly build a fire at a new campsite without wasting time on obtaining sparks. The fire literally traveled with the tribe, moving from one campsite to another. Losing fire in the harsh winter conditions was considered a real disaster, threatening the life of the family. It was incredibly difficult and painful to rekindle it with frozen, stiff hands, striking a spark from flint against a striker. The slightest mistake or damp tinder could leave people out in the cold without heat. Therefore, fire was cherished like a living creature that required constant care and attention. When cooking food inside the dwelling, the steam rising from the cauldrons played an unexpectedly useful role. It helped to naturally humidify the dry, frosty air, which was difficult to breathe. The humidity made the atmosphere in the tepee more comfortable for the mucous membranes of the inhabitants' noses and throats. This was a pleasant side effect of preparing the evening meal. However, excess moisture was extremely harmful, as condensation could settle on sleeping skins and clothing. Therefore, the lids of the cauldrons were kept tightly closed, releasing steam in measured doses and only when necessary. Humidity balance was important for the health of the lungs and the general well-being of people in a confined space. The Indians took great care to ensure that the air remained fresh and moderately dry. The ashes that accumulated in the hearth were never simply thrown away as useless rubbish. They were carefully collected and used for additional insulation around the edges of the dwelling or for various household needs. Even the waste from combustion was put to good use, demonstrating the waste-free and economical lifestyle of the nomads. A thrifty attitude towards resources was the basis for survival in the wild. The cleanliness of the hearth was practically a sacred duty for the mistress of the tepee. Fire was considered a sacred gift from higher powers, sent to people to protect them from deadly cold and darkness. The attitude towards it was invariably respectful, cautious, and filled with sincere gratitude. Desecrating the fire with rubbish or careless handling was a strict taboo in many tribes. On long, dark winter evenings, the fire in the center of the dwelling was the only source of light available. Its soft, lively glow dispelled the thick darkness, creating an island of safety in the middle of the endless, snow-covered steppe. People gathered around this spot of light, feeling protected from the outside world. It was the light of the fire that determined the family's waking hours during the winter. It was the constant, round-the-clock work of the stoker, which every inhabitant of the plains performed from early childhood. The ability to choose the right log, adjust the coals in time, and calculate the fuel supply was more important than the ability to shoot a bow. Survival in winter revolved around this continuous and complex dance with fire. It was the price people paid for the opportunity to live in a harsh climate. The winter dwellings of the Great Plains tribes were a compromise between comfort and the need to move quickly. In the event of a sudden attack by enemies or a lack of game, the tribe had to gather and leave, regardless of the weather. The tepee was ingenious in that it combined the permanence of a house with the mobility of a tent. Breaking camp in the cold was a harsh ordeal. Frozen knots in the stiff, ice-covered leather required strength and skill, but the design allowed the huge house to be folded into compact bundles that were loaded onto travois. The travois were made from the same poles that served as the frame for the tepee. It turned out that the house carried itself. Dogs, and later horses, pulled this load through the snow. Nothing remained at the campsite except circles of trampled earth and ashes from the fires. In winter, mobility was reduced due to deep snow, so they tried to keep their journey short. If a storm caught them on the road, people could quickly build a temporary shelter using poles and a tire as a simple canopy or windbreak. The ability to quickly create a microclimate anywhere was key to survival. The weight of winter equipment was significant, and this limited the number of items a family owned. Everything had to be functional and necessary. Extra weight could slow down movement and cost lives. When tribes moved to reservations and began living in log cabins, they faced a new problem. Wooden houses could not be moved, and they accumulated dirt and disease. Mobile dwellings were cleaner because people regularly moved to fresh locations. The ability to pack up their world in an hour and set it up again in another place gave them an incredible sense of freedom. The Indians were not tied to real estate. Their home was the entire prairie. The winter tepee was a ship on which they sailed across the white sea of snow. Interestingly, even in the most difficult times, the decoration of dwellings did not stop. Beauty and functionality went hand in hand. A painted tire or an embroidered entrance flap was the pride of the hostess. This survival technology had been honed over thousands of years. Every detail, every knot, every seam had been tested by countless winters. It was a perfect fusion of engineering and nature. Today, we can only marvel at how people with a minimal set of tools created homes capable of withstanding the elements that still paralyze modern cities today. The history of the winter dwellings of the indigenous peoples of America is a lesson in incredible ingenuity and resilience. Using only skin, wood, earth, and snow, they created architecture that was perfectly adapted to some of the harshest climatic conditions on the planet. Teepees, earthen houses, and wigwams were not primitive huts, but complex engineering systems with ventilation, thermal insulation, and aerodynamics. This knowledge allowed them not only to survive, but to live a full life, raise children, and preserve a rich culture in the middle of an icy desert. We see that true comfort is achieved not by the number of gadgets, but by a deep understanding of the laws of nature. Which of these ancient technologies did you find most surprising? Was it the chimney effect in the teepee, or the use of snow for insulation? Suggest in the comments what other aspects of indigenous people's lives you would like to learn about in future videos. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue our journey into history.